Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Singularity. Let's play. This is Northstar. I hope you are well, taking care of each other, and being kind to yourselves. New viewers to my channel, welcome. Returning viewers, welcome back. New viewers, check out my playlists. They're all organized from oldest to newest videos, except for my Northstar Talks Politics series. Yes, I do politics videos as well as gaming videos. Don't be mad at me for that. There's a lot of important stuff that needs to be said politically. And we're going to, as a society, culture, country, a species, stop the world from going to hell. We need to be willing to have discussions about these things, even if people don't always agree. And yes, I am convinced that I have the right of things. Who isn't? That doesn't mean I'm right. It also doesn't mean I'm wrong. But these discussions need to be had. So let's see. I'm doing the cheese exploration. Let's grab semi-firm cheese. Not quite cheese costs cheese and generates cheese, but most of the rest costs milk. I guess the idea is not quite cheese. It's so artificial. It's not made from milk. Except, well, it still is cheese product. Should probably just do, yeah, whatever's cheapest now, because got the badges I'm gonna get, and there is the matter of rankings. Grab a couple blue. Maybe that's a mistake. And some fresh cheese. The reason I'm doing these cheapest things is if I get 15 and be in the top 100, of course, that number will increase by then because other people are getting these too. It is competitive. But I mean, the cheese things, most of these things generate cheese, which only give me a little, maybe one or two more not quite cheese generators. It doesn't pay off to do things that are going to generate more cheese points, if you will. Also, some of these upgrades, which count, they're equivalent for ranking of just one generator, so not really worth it. That's a heck of a sigh I had there, if you will, or deep breath out. Not exactly, well, sort of deep in the amount of breath I get out of my lungs, slow and slightly forced. Stress breathing. For those, I don't know how much of that was caught also through the noise canceling. It's possible you guys heard nothing. For those new to my channel, I'm disabled with long COVID. It's a very stressful situation. I get to see even more of the evil inherent in the system and how it treats the most vulnerable. And yes, the system is evil. By that I mean a combination of our political system, our economic system, and overall social attitudes and behavior. I mean, you have the MAGA crowd, and that's obviously the people on the left can agree that that's vile. I don't have the dark matter for that upgrade right now. Pop over the Mesozoic Valley, but boom. Let's grab another stone geode. Mainly what I'm here for. Give it Darwinium. Can I for another Tricer? Yes, I can. Getting close to 500 there, after which I'll probably reset this. Grab that to the primary sim. But yeah, it's not just how we treat the most vulnerable members of society, ranging from the extreme patriarchalness that it, or some people might use the term authoritarian more colloquially, uh, ranging from the authoritarian bent of our welfare systems that give you resources that can only be used in a certain way, ranging from uh, food stamps, some of which can be as specific as things that can always be spent at farmers markets or only be spent on vegetables, to housing assistance programs, which of course there's always very specific requirements for different things, especially the more the emergency housing assistance. Um, like those programs. But which are relevant to me when I was leaving abusive situation, staying with family, and I was suddenly homeless for a day, and then also facing when I end up in Airbnb, actually facing violence from one of the guys there. Not severe violence, but the guy putting his hands on me and shoving me around is well, putting his hands on my face and shoving me around is still. Anyways, it's going from one situation where I suffered physical aggression, physical abuse, to another situation where I suffered physical aggression. Um, but yeah, ranging from food to housing, all the programs, all the things are very specific resources can only be used in this one thing. The idea that the bureaucrats and the policymakers, i.e., ultimately people who work for the politicians, who work for the billionaires, know better than everyone else what how resources should really be distributed and what's really best for people. It's patriarchal. It's what right wing people would call the nanny state. If there were any right wing people listening to this right now, which there most certainly aren't, because a lot of right wing people are vicious, and when they heard it was disabled, they're probably like, "Oh, I don't want to listen to this guy." Anyone who's disabled must deserve it, or some insane shit like that. They probably think, as if I got long COVID, as if it was my choice for my roommate to infect me with the virus to come back from business trip already infected with the coronavirus. Of course, a lot of right wingers try and deny that the coronavirus was actually dangerous, and they try and deny that long COVID is a real disease, and et cetera, and et cetera. All this shittiness that's really just fundamentally about wanting to dump on someone and them not wanting to admit that they were wrong about anything. Um, more stress breathing. So, um, the basic thing I keep wanting to say, and I can never quite figure this. My thoughts wander while I'm sitting drinking coffee, and I drink a heck of a lot of coffee. A heck of a lot of coffee. I was just drinking some. It's like noon. I still need to drink it just to be functional all because long COVID makes me very, very, very tired. So I need prodigious amounts of coffee to even function at the most basic level. Uh, but my thoughts wander, and I have thoughts of things I like to say in my channel, and then I just can't remember the thoughts that led to that, or how exactly something would be relevant to say. Like I know would be relevant, but or there's stuff that's too personal. I don't want to talk about my personal life and risk getting doxxed too much. Things, there's some things that are better kept anonymous from the internet. But basic fact of our society, and this needs to be said, is that power concedes nothing. Those with power concede nothing to the rest of us. They have to be forced into conceding it. This is a basic insight that, say, Marxists have had for the longest time, who have correctly argued that social democracy, and that's social democracy means like, say Nordic democracies, the so-called Nordic system. I was trying to skip this. That's an example of social democracy. It's not socialism. People misuse the phrase socialism to mean high government spending, generous welfare states. No. Socialism is worker control of the means of production. That sounds like someone says, oh no, that's communism. No, communism, colloquially, Marxist Leninism specifically, because technically communism is not the name of an ideology, even though it's often used that way. There's no such ideology as communism. This isn't some right wing, it's a. No. It's there is socialism. Marxist-Leninists are socialists, and communism refers to the utopian society, the dream that they hope that if they make the changes society want to make, someday will achieve communism. That's what the term actually means. It's the what might be called the late stage socialism, as opposed to being late stage capitalism today. You hear that term often. That term does sometimes get thrown around in Marxist circles, but non-Marxists use it too. Anti-capitalists broadly will use the phrase late stage socialism. And also, not all socialists are Marxists. Socialism predates Marx. The idealistic and utopian socialist traditions were around for something like 40 to 60 years before Karl Marx started doing his writing. And the Christian socialist traditions with them, Christian socialist traditions start actually deviated from the anarchist traditions around the time of Marx, really. But even though they were branching off around the same time, they weren't influenced by his writings so much as they were an entirely separate. I try and do a unique thing. I sometimes consider myself, many people on the left do, have to be special or whatever, but I try and integrate Christian socialist ideas with Marxist ideas, even though they come from entirely different traditions, because you can find pieces of truth in different, schools of philosophy. It's not that one has a monopoly on truth. They all have correct insights into what's wrong with capitalism and how to fix it. So I try to take the best from each, even though they can be contradictory at times. And then there becomes the difficult task of resolving those conflicts, which a lot of people hate conflicts and theories and ideas, and so they'd rather just, for some people, especially communists, i.e., Marxist-Leninists, they just insert ideology, political, social, economic ideology, straight into the part of the brain that religion used to go in. When in the Middle Ages and stuff, religion was much more dominant in society. People have made that critique, and there's some truth to it. That doesn't mean that Marxism is incorrect, just that some people, especially atheists who become Marxists, because there are far too many. Marx had some personal issues with religion because his parents were forced to convert to Catholicism in Germany. They were Jewish and they were forced to convert to Catholicism. So, Marx is ethnically Jewish and heritage, something that I'm sure right wing Israeli pigs would prefer to deny these days, but something that was a knowledge in the past, although it also fed into, you had the freaking Nazis going around and creating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories based on the fact that Marx was ethnically Jewish. They tried to say, oh, communism was a Jewish plot or whatever. It's like, fuck you. No, communism was a response to capitalism. Communism was a response to the vices and evils of the system that the Nazis were willing to double down on and defend with violence, because fascism is fundamentally about protecting capitalism from socialist unrest. The Nazis misnamed their party. They claimed it was socialist. It was not socialist, but it was yet another lie. Hitler was a compulsive liar, essentially, and he lied about everything. Just like Trump, he go around just making up stuff and using terms in ways that were completely incorrect and just saying anything to get power. And so one of those lies was calling his party socialist. It was not socialist. It never was. It managed to attract some socialists into its ranks for a while, and then those actual people with socialist ideas were purged in the Night of the Long Knives, which most people have heard the term, and they just think it's, they vaguely know that it was a purge, a series of political assassinations in the Nazi Party. They don't know what it was about usually. It was fundamentally, it was the Nazi Party going and finding the people who had economic populist left-wing ideas who had joined the Nazi Party because they believed the bullshit about it supposedly being socialist. It was not. It was always anti-communist, but supposedly socialist, but that was always a lie. And so enough of those people would reach positions of power that it was threatening the dominance of the right-wingers who understood that it was really just about protecting capitalism. And so they went and they hunted down and killed those people in the Night of the Long Knives, or ejected them from power and forced them to admit they were, quote, wrong all along. systems will often force people to make false confessions of having been incorrect. The United States did that to Henry Agrid Wallace, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, who had the vice presidency stolen from him in 1944. He would have been vice president a second time. He was vice president from 40 to 44. He would have been again from 44 to 48, except FDR would have died and he would have become president. And everyone knew, including him, that FDR was going to die at that point. But Democratic Party bosses rigged the 1944 Democratic Party convention, stole the vice presidency from Wallace, even though the vast majority of Americans, it was something like, seen statistics as high as 95% or 98% of Democratic Party voting members, people were active in the party, who, as opposed to just people who would vote blue. But something like a very high percentage of Democratic Party members favored Wallace for the vice presidency, as compared to only 4% favored Truman. Only 4%. And among undecided voters, people voted blue but weren't Democratic Party members, and Republicans even. Wallace was still drastically more popular, Henry Agrid Wallace, than Truman. And Wallace was far to the left of Truman. He was a social democrat. He would have tried to turn the United States into a Nordic-style democracy. We would have had a Nordic system in the U.S. if Henry Wallace had become president. And there would have been no Cold War either, because he was a fan of friendship with the Soviet Union. That's a weird graphic over the rover. And the only reason we really had the Cold War is because Truman created the Truman Doctrine, and on top of that, he took hostile actions to provoke the Soviets. And on top of that, sure, if non-dairy there was quite a good idea, but grabbed anyways. And on top of that, he took Winston Churchill, who had just lost re-election in the UK, because Churchill was a right-wing bastard. And I really mean it. He was a horrendous human being. He used artillery, like army artillery pieces, on a coal miner strike in Wales early in his political career. He shelled basically he brought in the army. Most of the strikers dispersed because they saw they were going to get shot, and they were correctly afraid of the fascist that was Churchill. Well, he's not fascist, but an authoritarian. Although he did, in his memoirs, write some bullshit about supposed Aryan superiority. Winston Churchill wrote that in his memoirs. He was a sympathizer with the Nazi cause, even if he wasn't a fascist. But yeah, most of the coal miners dispersed because they knew Churchill meant business, intended to mass murder as many of them as necessary to break the strike. But some hung around and they barricaded themselves in a building, which Churchill then had the artillery pieces shell. So he fired on unarmed. I think they were unarmed. Maybe they were armed, but they were but they were not shooting anyone. He shelled, and it was like the Union headquarters or something. And he shelled it with people inside and killed a number of them and severely injured a whole bunch more. And then, sent the army, rounded up the survivors, threw them in jail. That was part of how Winston Churchill got his political career started. He was a piece of human garbage. And he eventually became the leader of the UK. And he treated the people, the working class people of London, terribly during the Blitz. He had no sensitivity to the fact that they were getting blown up by Nazi warplanes. Later on, he would try and spin things and claim he really cared, and it was just, and he would create this false image of like this man of steel. By the way, that's what Stalin means. It's man of steel in Russian. So if Joseph Stalin, his actual last name was something else. I think it was Yanovich or something. Or Yosef something he had an entirely different last name. Literally, the name that he's most known by literally just means man of steel. But Churchill created this image of himself as the man of steel, or whatever. against the Nazi Blitz, against the Nazi war machine. But it's a somewhat false image. He didn't give a shit about ordinary people who were being blown up. He was willing to throw all their lives away for victory, so that the British ruling class, the elites, the people who would run a colonial empire all across the world for generations, could maintain their power instead of, he was worried the Nazis would take away British colonies, which they would have. They would have taken them for themselves. He evacuated the very wealthy to upstate up country parts of the UK. This is where you get like the Chronicles of Narnia at the very start. It's some kids of one of those wealthy families who have been like sent to live with basically a nanny in like northern England or Scotland or something, and the nanny's not very nice, and they retreat into this fantasy world, and that's the Chronicles of Narnia, which there's a lot of symbolism and metaphor in it. It's funny people don't understand this about Narnia, about the fortunately I had a mother who was obsessed with symbolism and everything. She went way too far with it, but was correct, and I've read stuff about it. It's not just one person saying it. The Chronicles of Narnia really were about this. That is a correct statement. But anyways, so Churchill didn't care about people in London dying. He did very little to provide relief. When their houses got blown up, he did very little to provide them with emergency shelter. He just let them suffer and die. And he didn't even do much to ensure the continuation of food supplies to people in London. And he rightly provoked a lot of rage among the British working class for what he had done. And so he lost re-election by, if I remember correctly, a pretty significant margin, although maybe it wasn't. I forget. It was definitely among the working class voters. He may have had more support middle class people in Northern England who didn't know what he had done in London. But he lost re-election because of his sins, basically. This is something that's been lost to history and the mythos that Churchill created. He even said, I believe history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. He's one of those narcissists, like George Washington, actually, who's obsessed with his own legacy during his lifetime and worked to spin events. Yes, George Washington was a narcissist and a terrible human being, and a slave owner, of course. Not understood is that he sometimes bent or nearly broke the law to maintain control of the slaves. It wasn't just, oh, well, the law says this is how it works. There was a law in Philadelphia that if he had slaves with him there more than a certain number of years, they'd automatically be set free. So he rotated his slaves out rather than letting them be set free. It's not as if he couldn't have done it. He worked to, it's like, how people do tax evasion. He worked to evade freeman laws in Philadelphia. Ted Sturmer, he's a historian who has a YouTube channel. Ted Sturmer does an excellent thing about this. He talks about how George Washington did this and how George Washington was obsessed with his own legacy and was actually a terrible human being who's basically become worshipped because it's important to nationalism in the United States, this mythos of a perfect founding father who was actually a really terrible human being. But it's a convenient lie in that if Americans don't understand this, they're never going to free themselves of the push towards like fascism, because fascism and nationalism are very tied up with each other. Trump is a symptom of the worship of the founding fathers, according to this historian, and I think he takes it a little far. The degree to which he says that's true, he's largely correct. I've been watching a number of things, and many, many, many times I've watched something that this Ted Sturmer guy does, and I'm like, yep, that's dead on. Dead on, but sometimes he doesn't follow things all the way through their logical conclusions. Specifically, sometimes it's obvious that capitalism underlies certain things, and he never will criticize capitalism. Maybe he's secretly a Marxist, and he's just knows that no one will take him seriously if he says certain things, or maybe he just, I don't know. Liberals will often bend over backwards to avoid criticizing capitalism. He's not actually a liberal. He'd be considered progressive in the international sense of the word. And he actually teaches or visiting scholar from Denmark or something, so he knows that the word liberal means something else, but he self-describes as a liberal to Americans because he knows Americans use the word liberal to mean left wing. Overseas, liberalism is a term for right wing ideology. Margaret Thatcher was a liberal. Ronald Reagan was a liberal. It's not progressives. Bernie Sanders would not be considered a liberal in the global sense of the word, in the sense that's usually used in anywhere but the US. But anyways, he may bend over backwards to defend capitalism, but he is very, very correct about nationalism, at least. And I do recommend his channel, and I will not miss a chance to plug it here and there. And he does talk about power concedes nothing. He is dead correct about that. But anyways, that phrase is something that I thought myself, but I've heard it reflected and said word for word, I think even once or twice on his channel. It's something that, I mean, it's not that sophisticated an idea to come up with, so it's not like I'm brilliant for thinking of this. It's a fairly simple claim, right? But hmm. Let's grab a few more human generators here. Sturmer, power concedes nothing. Sorry, I kind of lose my train of thought. My long COVID, that happens at times. Let's pop over to Dairy Delights again. Dairy Delights exploration. Yeah, but Churchill. Oh yeah, the Cold War. So Churchill was a monster, obsessed with his own legacy, and the only reason he's basically worshipped today is because one, he was obsessed with his legacy and worked to make sure that the history books were excessively kind to him, and two, right wingers in the United States and the UK needed a hero of World War II, especially the United States, and they couldn't have FDR be the hero because FDR was very, very, very progressive. You know, he created the New Deal. So they needed a hero, but it couldn't be Churchill, and it definitely couldn't be Stalin because these are anti-communist pieces of garbage who wanted to create a nationalist mythos. So they went, and so ideally it'd be someone English speaking also because these were nationalists. So who did they go with? They went with Winston Churchill, and they worked to make him a hero and pump up his legacy over time to the exclusion of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really deserves a lot more credit than Churchill did. The United States made a much bigger difference in World War II, although the Soviets made a bigger difference even than the U.S. That's the role of the U.S. in World War II was not quite the same as, say, World War I, where the U.S. did very, very little, and it was the threat of unlimited American troops and war material that caused the Central Powers to surrender and be demoralized and lose battles even before then. It wasn't quite so drastic, you know. Normandy invasions did happen. U.S. did lose quite a few people fighting through Italy, made a substantial contribution. It's just that these contributions were dwarfed by the amount of struggle and misery and grit that the Soviets had in the Eastern Front facing the Nazi war machine. And they also generated an immense amount of war material. It cannot be underestimated at all or understated how much war material the Soviets really generated. A lot of this was, you know, rifles and tanks that were, yes, some people point they were cheaply made, but they were well designed and that they were designed to be cheaply made because they need a lot of them. And the Soviet strategy, the grand strategy, was designed around their being at a technological disadvantage compared to the Germans. No, it's not for some racist reasons. It's because Soviet Union, when it formed, was a technologically backwards, economically backwards country with 1/13 the GDP per capita of the US and generations behind the West technologically. And so they were catching up, but they hadn't caught up by World War II for certain. And tanks are designed, you know, 7 years, 6 years ahead of time. It takes time to get through the prototyping. So tanks that were, you know, produced in 1941, 42 were being designed in the 30s, in the late 30s or earlier, And back at that point, the Soviets definitely were behind the West technologically. So they designed tanks that were extremely cost effective, that were rugged, that could deal with mud and cold and stuff like this very well. They were excellent tanks for the job. The job wasn't to trade off one for one with Nazi tanks, that one for one Soviet tanks would lose, although not by nearly as much as you would think. Like 10 Soviet tanks would probably be 8 German ones. It was actually a reasonable trade off rate. But they were actually quite close. But that little bit of extra quality the Nazi tanks had came at immense expense and greatly slowed down their rate of production. Um, and the Soviets could had the manpower that they could produce if they had enough tanks. They could train, 2-3 times as many tank divisions because they had a much larger population, which meant there were a larger number of people who had the aptitudes and education and such to be tank drivers. They also had to design their tanks to be worked by relatively uneducated people, so that's another reason the quality is a little less. Germans had the advantage of an educated populace. The Soviet Union was working to teach their population to read and write for the first time ever, and they did that very successfully. By the 50s, they had I think it was a 90 something percent literacy rate from like less than 30% when the Soviet Union formed or something. It was insane how quickly they taught their population to read and write. Both the Soviet Union and Maoist China achieved incredible successes with their literacy programs, beyond anything any capitalist country has ever achieved in terms of rapid literacy. Some of the UN initiatives to bring literacy to certain third world countries have come close, but none of them have ever come quite to this level. And these were international programs that, mind you, often had funding from both the West and the Soviet bloc because they were during the Cold War. So you can't even blame that. You can't even credit that to capitalism because that was combined capitalist socialist efforts. Even in the modern era, you had Cuba helping with these programs. Because the U.S. places them under blockade. Cuba does an immense amount of foreign aid, particularly medical aid, but also stuff like literacy. Yeah, they send doctors all around the world, which leads, because there must be some reason it's wrong, to right wingers saying, "Oh, they're paying their doctors slave wages. The doctors are not appreciated. It's terrible." No, it's not. They're helping people to survive. Yes, their doctors don't make high salaries, although it's not slave wages. That's an exaggeration. Because in medicine in Cuba, it's not about making the most money, it's about helping people. I wanted to be a physician. I was trained to be a physician. I was going to be a physician if I didn't get long COVID, although I would have started medical school at 32 or 33 instead of 22 or 23. So I lost a lot of years because the system really honestly resisted giving me that opportunity, and I had to work twice as hard and become twice as qualified as some people from wealthier families who had the advantage of going through college with like all this family support. No, I had to deal with abusive parents, plural, both parents, and family drama and attempts to distract me from my studies and underdeveloped social skills from a stifling upbringing and all these things in college. So my undergrad grades were not. And bullying and attempts to target and actively ruin my reputation that were connected to my parents directly and indirectly. Sometimes one of them causing these things, sometimes people just not liking what shitbags my parents were and attacking me. This happened over and over throughout my life. Like, it's appropriate to attack me because my parents are terrible people? No, I don't like them either. I don't like their shitty behavior. I try to be nice to them despite it. Because being cruel or vindictive or seeking vengeance against people for doing wrong never did anyone any good. This leads some people to not believing I could be so kind and assuming that, oh, they must not really be so bad if you're nice to them. It's like, no, they are quite bad. I just took the turn the other cheek, bless your oppressors lines that Jesus had in the Bible. Take that very, very seriously. I say took because I came to this conclusion at a very young age that it didn't matter how people treat me. I was going to try and live by what's written in the Bible about turning the other cheek, no matter how hard it was. And I've been remarkably successful at that, though not always perfectly. There have been times I failed to turn the other cheek, sometimes critical moments, but most people would have failed to do this far more often and far before me, because most people don't have this commitment. If someone treats them like crap, they'll treat them like crap back. That's not who I am. That's never been who I am. The sharks give simulation speed. Interesting. 1.25 times 1.3 times simulation speed. Interesting. Manta rays there, which are actually fairly closely genetically related to sharks, if I remember correctly. Could be mixing this up with some other thing. Like maybe that boneless fish that dates back, that's like really ancient, that sometimes people thought was extinct, or I don't remember. Maybe mixing this up with something else, so don't take my word for that. Anyways, my memory with long COVID is somewhat impaired. Just waiting for this last knowledge bit. This video's gone long enough. I'll probably pick this back up later. I can let the simulation go hours or more, or days more, and pick it back up later and have a whole bunch of upgrades to make. All right, well, I hope you folks enjoyed this video. I guess a few key points. Power concedes nothing. Do remember that. Capitalism is a vile system. I will keep reminding people of this. They will think it's ridiculous. I can make many arguments for that, but of course, there's no real engagement with this channel because it's so tiny. And most people, I'm sure most of my audience is honestly listening to videos with the sound muted because they're at work or something and just want something to look at. So I don't know if anyone's even hearing anything I'm saying here, but happy to have honest discussions and debates and engagement with this. Although I'd really like to do is do a podcast, not like Joe Rogan, but not Joe Rogan, obviously, because I'm not a right winger, but get people on and talk about these things instead of random debates and comment sections with too often trolls who don't actually want to have a honest debate at all. They just want to. I'm not a debate bro, but I do think people have to discuss issues where our society is ever going to change. People are never move forward in their views. Just grab me a few more of these generators. I'm sure some people are like, that's exactly what a debate bro is. If it is, well, then you shouldn't hate debate bros if that's really what a debate bro is. But terms acquire reputations through constant smear campaigns. At the same time, people want it to apply to anyone they don't like. All right, well, I'm going to cut this here. Hope you all enjoy this. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star leading home. Until next time, it's